So here's a question for you. If a nation is founded on principles that are supposed to be self-evident, things like natural rights, political equality, why are we still fighting over them centuries later?
That's the core question, isn't it?
It is. Can that story, the one about a democracy built on these universal ideals, actually survive a history that is just so full of betrayal?
And contradiction.
Exactly. And that's what we're getting into today, looking at Jill Lepore's monumental 2018 book, These Truths, A History of the United States.
It's a huge narrative, but it's her approach that is so interesting. She really transforms the whole idea of a national history into an investigation.
Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we also include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust, giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment.
Should you read this book? This should help.
It's also excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
Welcome. And what we're going to dig into here is how Lepore uses that investigation framework to test those three founding principles.
Political equality, natural rights, and popular sovereignty.
Right. She treats them not as facts, but as propositions, as ideas that have to be proven or, well, disproven by the historical evidence over and over again.
That framing feels so important, especially when you think about when this book came out, 2018. That's crucial context.
Oh, absolutely. We have to consider the immediate need for a book like this. Lepore was writing directly into a period of just extreme polarization, truth decay, as some called it.
A crisis of democratic legitimacy.
A profound one. So she's essentially asking, when a society can agree on basic facts, can it still be governed by reason and truth?
That gives the whole project an urgency you don't get from a standard textbook.
Exactly. She's not just recounting the past. She's on a kind of rescue mission for the idea that a society can govern itself through evidence and shared reflection.
Okay, so before we get into the structure of her argument, let's talk about the author herself, her credibility, her ethos. She already has this powerful identity, right? She's a Harvard historian, a distinguished scholar, but she's also been writing for The New Yorker for years.
And that dual identity is probably her greatest asset in building trust. She has the academic rigor, that incredible command of the material, but she also has the accessibility of a public intellectual.
It establishes her as this civic-minded historian who really believes in empirical inquiry.
Yes, and she shows that commitment in her choices, consciously foregrounding voices that are often, pushed to the margins in other surveys.
And she does that by alternating between the big institutional analysis and these really intimate biographical sketches.
Exactly. She'll bring in someone like Margaret Chase Smith, who took a stand against McCarthy, or Phyllis Schlafly, who was so central to mobilizing modern conservatism. It humanizes the whole process.
It shows that history isn't just made by presidents.
It's made by individuals reacting to those truths.
So her purpose isn't just to narrate. It's really to cultivate citizens who are capable of evidence-based judgment. That sounds less about comfort and much more about challenging the reader.
It is, and that leads directly to the book's tone, which is really complex. Reviewers said she walks an uneasy path.
She's not a cheerleader, but she's not a complete cynic either.
Not at all. The tone shifts dramatically. It can be critical and, well, almost elegiac one moment, mourning the failures of the past, and then consciously hopeful the next.
It seems like she's trying to salvage something meaningful from a very violent and unjust past, refusing to settle for just reverence or just contempt.
And maintaining that balance over 900 pages is incredibly difficult. But that difficulty is part of her argument. For the democratic project to survive, we have to hold both the soaring ideals and the brutal reality in our minds at the same time.
And for you listening, just know you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
We're working through this material to give you the clearest possible picture.
Okay, let's shift to the structural argument. This is our main tool for persuasion, and it's where the analysis gets really fascinating.
It really is.
Instead of just a timeline, she frames the whole national history as an inquiry. It's less like a civic lesson you memorize and more like you're a juror deciding a case.
That inquiry frame is the engine of the entire book. The question she keeps coming back to is, does American history prove these truths, or does it belie them?
So by constantly returning to that question, she forces you to engage with history as something that's still being built and evaluated.
It's not a fixed set of facts, glorious or otherwise. It's contingent, it's dynamic.
So the narrative structure is the argument. It's not just what she says, but how she organizes the saying of it.
Precisely. And she takes this one step further in a way that critics found both brilliant and, well, controversial. She essentially implots the four parts of the book into different narrative modes.
Narrative modes, what do you mean by that? Are we talking about literary criticism now?
Yeah. We're talking about rhetorical history. A historian can choose to present events as a decline, a glorious rise, a painful lesson.
Or just a confusing mess?
Right. And Lepore makes four very distinct choices for four different eras.
Okay, break this down for us. How does she frame them?
The first part, the revolution and the founding, she frames as a romance.
Romance.
Yeah.
So a heroic redemptive story.
Exactly. A redemptive founding focusing on noble origins and establishing those central truths. It gives the founders a level of heroism, which sets up the dramatic tension for everything that comes after.
Okay, so we start with the classic origin story. What happens when we get to the Civil War?
That's where it immediately shifts into high tragedy. The failure of that original vision, the inability to resolve slavery, it leads to an inevitable, terrible outcome.
Tragedy as in the loss of something that could have been great.
That's it. And that tone defines the entire section.
And then she changes the mood again as we move into the 20th century.
Yes. The early 20th century, the era of reform, suffrage, the New Deal, she frames as a kind of democratic comedy.
Comedy not as in funny, I'm guessing.
No, not funny. Comedy in the classical sense. A story where conflicts are eventually resolved, usually through collective action, leading to a restored community and a cautiously positive outcome. It suggests progress is actually possible.
But I'm betting that hope doesn't last into our own time. What about the contemporary era?
The final section is framed as corrosive satire. Satire exposes vice and folly. And here, the ideals themselves, truth, equality, are undermined and mocked by political realities, by media decay. The ending is unsettling, intentionally so.
Wow, that structural choice is incredibly powerful. It dictates the emotional temperature for the reader before they even look at a single piece of evidence.
It's an incredibly sophisticated way to build an argument, and we often explore these structural choices and their impact on understanding history. You can find more of this kind of critique on Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Let's move to her appeals, specifically pathos, the emotional appeal. The structure invites emotion, but how does the content itself create that moral weight?
Lepore's main emotional strategy is to generate what you could call moral dissonance. She does this through stark, relentless juxtaposition.
So she'll place the soaring democratic rhetoric, the speeches, the declarations,
right next to the brutal realities of slavery, of Native American dispossession, of exclusion.
that has to be designed to make the reader deeply uncomfortable.
It is. The goal is to invite anger and grief by showing that massive gap between promise and performance. She very deliberately laments the lack of any real national mourning for the victims of slavery, and she dwells on the grisly epic of colonization.
She forces you to feel the scale of the injustice.
She does, but she grounds this powerful emotional punch in rigorous attention to evidence her logos. She pays attention to tiny details like textual variants.
What's a good example of that?
The best example is the Declaration of Independence itself. She tracks how Thomas Jefferson's early draft used the phrase sacred and undeniable rights.
Right, which later became self-evident. Why is that tiny word change so important?
Because it's a fundamental ideological shift. Sacred and undeniable grounds rights in a religious authority, a divine truth.
Okay.
But self-evident grounds rights in empirical observation, in reason, in human judgment. It's the move from a religious to an empiricist understanding of rights. She uses that one small change to show how the very basis of American political authority was shifting from the very beginning.
That really proves her commitment to this evidence-based investigation.
It does, but she doesn't stop there. One of the most unusual and frankly crucial arguments in the whole book is the attention she gives to communication technology.
This isn't a history computer, so why is media so central to the fate of these truths?
Because she argues that these infrastructures, from the printing press to mass journalism, talk radio, and now algorithmic sorting, they all encode both democratic ideals and social biases.
They can be tools that unify or tools that divide.
That's her dramatic claim. She follows the shift from a relatively stable, shared media environment to one that is defined by fragmentation and ideological sorting.
So media starts as a tool for self-governance, for circulating shared information, but it evolves into something that tears society apart.
That's what she argues, that the rise of partisan media and computer-driven algorithms has brought the country to the brink of a second civil war by completely eroding the shared factual basis we need for political life.
A very powerful claim. And brings us back to her core strategy, contradiction and juxtaposition.
Absolutely. By placing these extreme slavery and liberty talk, unifying media and fragmenting algorithms side by side without an easy resolution, she forces you to hold these incompatible truths in your mind.
She makes you resist simple stories.
Yes. Resisting the simple narrative of either inevitable triumph or just constant oppression, the reality is much, much messier.
So finally, we have to look at the evaluation. A one-volume history of this scale is bound to have limits and controversies. What did critics generally say?
Most reviewers described these truths as magisterial, astounding. Its main strength is making national history feel morally and civically urgent without falling into simple nostalgia or paralyzing despair.
And that framing question, the inquiry, is key. It keeps the reader evaluating instead of just memorizing.
Right. But history is always controversial. We noted that some critics, particularly from publications like Law and Liberty or scholars at the Hoover Institution, argued the narrative was slanted.
Slanted in what way?
They claim the book unfairly treats capitalism, conservatism, and the press. The argument is that Lepore downplays or misrepresents conservative intellectual traditions, viewing everything through too much of a liberal lens.
And from a rhetorical standpoint, what does that critique tell us?
It tells us that while the book is masterfully crafted, its ethical appeal, its ethos, might not persuade readers who already have strong small government or classical liberal beliefs.
They might see her choices not as neutral history, but as ideological positioning.
Which brings us to the final assessment. The book is incredibly effective at turning a national story into an inquiry about democracy. But its limits are in the moral stance and the selectivity that's just inevitable in a single volume.
What one person finds clarifying, another will find partial.
And that, ultimately, is the truth the book forces us to reckon with. History is never just data. It is always framed by the storyteller's choices, the structure, the tone, the juxtapositions. Those choices determine the argument you receive.
Which brings us right back to where we started. If history is always filtered through a chosen structure, romance, tragedy, comedy, or satire, what framework are you using to understand this present moment? And what does that framework encourage you to believe about the future of those founding truths? Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.